I believe the invasion of Ukraine is the defining moment of my time in government and in foreign affairs. It's the most important thing that's happened, certainly since 9/11, for an American, to have the large power try to gobble up its neighbor, to violate rule number one, thou shalt not invade thy neighbor.
I can repeat that because you say it all the time. Thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. Welcome. This is Christiane Amanpour presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin. And I'm Christiane. You might know me as a long-term foreign correspondent and also with a show interviewing world leaders and trying to hold them to account.
And I'm Jamie Rubin. I've been working in foreign policy for 30, 40 years almost, it feels like. Worked for Joe Biden and also for Bill Clinton in the State Department.
And as you know, we were married for 20 years, divorced for 7. We're picking up the conversation. There's a longer version of our story, and you can hear that in episode 1. But let's get going. Look, we want to ask a couple of things in this episode. What will it take to convince Putin to end the war in Ukraine? That's what Trump wants. Does he have the tools to get that done? But I think we have to start with this Shakespearean tragedy that is unfolding around President Biden, who obviously made his first term, well, his only term, about the soul of the nation, battling for the soul of America, but also to protect and defend democracy. And that was shown through his defense and protection of Ukraine. And now he's got a cancer diagnosis. There's a book out which is really casting aspersions on not just his mental acuity, but also on whether there was a cover up in the White House.
Well, I've known Joe Biden a long, long time. He was the first politician I ever worked for. I started working for him in 1988. And when I first started working for him, it was interrupted by his brain aneurysm, where he nearly died. And he was out of commission for, I think it was like 9, 10 months. That follows on the tragedies in the Biden family that have been discussed extensively, with the car accident of his wife and kids. And then now diagnosed with cancer, apparently treatable, but whether how long is still an open question. And yeah, by the time I saw him then, which was 27 years since I met him, he was a different person. He was slower. He was older. He was, an older person. The question of whether that affected his presidency and the politics of it, we can get into.
Well, let me say something there, because I have this incredible story around the Iranian American hostages who were wrongfully held in Iran, basically as pawns. One of them is my friend, Siamak Namazi. And he had been held by the time he was released for almost 8 years. And he had been left behind under various deals, prisoner swap deals under the Obama administration, under the first Trump administration. And now he was desperate. And now there are about 3 or even 5 of them there. Long story short, I was trying to do everything I could to get their story out. I gave a letter to Jill Biden in which I wrote to her asking her to please, inveigle and weigh in with her husband, the president, on these poor pawns, Americans who are being held and withering away in the Iranian gulag at Evin. This was when she was in London for King Charles's coronation. So it was May 2 years ago. And I asked if I could give her the letter, and her people said yes. So I gave her the letter. And then I didn't hear anything back. Several months later, Jamie, these Americans were released. It took a little bit of while and a bit of negotiating, and money was paid because of the money that was owed the Iranian regime. But they came out. And in my opinion, I don't know why. You may have an idea as to why the president's people potentially weren't getting him this story and putting it in front of him. But when he saw it, action was taken, and they're out.
No question, when President Biden was operating for those 4 years, a lot of Americans were released who were unfairly held around the world. I think that Tony Blinken used to carry a little card in his pocket with the names of all these people, and I watched him check off the list, and dozens and dozens of Americans from all over. The biggest one, obviously, was with Putin, the prisoner exchange. Someday we may even talk about that. There's some great stories about that. But prisoner releases was something Biden cared about. It was very personal for him. and I'm glad he was able to help. Look, he knew us well. I remember when our son Darius was born, and I think it was, he called me up. He was then a senator, and he said, "Would I ask you, on behalf of his wife, to give a talk at the University of Delaware?"
Oh,
And so I told you
yes.
about it, and she then spoke to you, and we traveled up to Delaware with Darius. This was his first trip, and we spent the day with the Bidens. That was probably 2000,
2000.
the
Hmm.
spring of 2000, and you got to see him up close in his family situation. He was the first politician I was ever close to, and knew me. I knew his kids. I knew he knew you. He met Darius when Darius was about this big. And Later on, he actually asked me to come work for him in
I remember
2002.
that in this, no, not in this house, in the previous house. And he called you and asked you to be chief of staff, right? For when he was
Yes,
chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations
that's
Committee.
correct.
And it
And I said
caused us to
no.
go into an implosion, a family implosion. Oh my God, back to the United States, small child, what, this, that. And I was the foreign correspondent, chief foreign correspondent all over the world. And you said no. And sometimes I wonder, I mean, I'm slightly tongue in cheek, but maybe not.
And the reason I didn't take the job were multiple, but one of them was we had just left government. I had just eliminated that, sort of 24-hour, 7 days a week job. We had a little son. He was 2 years old. And it was, frankly, I don't know whether you'd agree, but it was the glorious time of our marriage, those
It
first
was.
several years. And took a lot to make me even think about moving back to Washington, but I ended up saying no. But we stayed connected for a while, and that's a whole nother story. But getting back to the issue of the day, look, I know there are a lot of Democrats and a lot of journalists who are spending a lot of time saying, what if this, what if that? Was there a cover up? Should we have known? I don't think it was a secret that Biden was aging and that he was slower, and many people saw him. I've talked to Tony Blinken about this as recently as yesterday. Tony told me very flatly, when it came to making decisions about war and peace, about diplomacy, about China, about Putin, about the threat of use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, he never saw any indication that Biden's acuity was affected. Was his communicative skills, his performative skills affected? Yeah, but his performances were something I still think we'd be better off having in the White House. The real issue is whether he should run again, and that's what everybody has made a big deal out of. And let's remember, in the end, he didn't run again, and he didn't
Well,
put himself
he was
forward.
forced out and he shouldn't have run again. And he did say he'd be a transitional president. And again, I say it's Shakespearean, it's King Lear, it's the elderly, aging, maybe dying leader who,
It's hard to give
hasn't
up power.
really.
Nobody's good at it.
Right.
Look
And
around the
and and
world. None of these leaders can give up power. It's
it's
very
very,
hard.
very difficult. Of course, America is a democracy and you have to give up power if you're voted out. But
Right, but
I
voluntarily giving up power is very, very difficult. And he was being asked to do what nobody done before, was say one term. George Washington, two. So Ronald Reagan, two. FDR did four, and then they changed the rules. But he was being asked to give up power, and the whole system is designed to keep, what is effectively like a Roman emperor, the aides, the eunuchs, the people around him, to keep that power in place. It's very
aides
hard to
and
give it up.
eunuchs. Do you got any names?
Not going to put a name to a eunuch, but I have some in mind.
So I have a bit of a beef with the whole American political journalism. I mean, can we just please admit that the Beltway journalists, I'm sorry, have got almost every election wrong in the last, ever since Trump 2016, for sure, and all the midterms and everything else. But what I thought was really important that none of us really focused enough on was throughout the last year of Biden, there's this thing. How do you have faith in the direction of the country? And that was completely off the charts bad. People didn't have faith in the way the country was going, what direction it was going. And another thing, the lawyer, the special counsel, I guess he was called, was he Ben Hur?
Her. No, that's a
Maybe not
different
Ben
one.
Hur.
Ben
It was
Hur
some
is
other Hur.
That's the Roman Ben
But
Hur.
anyway,
But Mr. Hur,
Robert Hur, no, Mr. Hur, Robert Hur. So he interviewed him about documents, and he came out afterward and he said Biden would likely present himself to a jury as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. And that, they describe as like literally the first independent truthful description of President Biden by a third party. Of course, he was, pilloried by the Democrats. But I remember Mark Thompson, the head of CNN, saying to me in the corridor, we need to get that transcript, not just the transcript, we need to get the tape or whatever, the recording. And I wonder if we had been able to have it in February of 2024, which is when this interview happened, would the whole dynamic have changed? Would the idea?
you know,
I know you can't prove a
history
negative.
is it occurs forward, not backward. But if we're going to play this game of what ifs, I think when we first started talking about this, you have to realize how hard it is to give up power. And it wasn't until Biden's disastrous debate performance showed everyone the worst version of Biden. Because remember, as an older man, some days he was perfectly fine, gave perfectly good State of the Union speeches, had meetings with world leaders, traveled all over the world. Everything was fine. But sometimes he wasn't fine. And we saw that in the debate. And then the Democrats made clear to him that they were worried about their future with him on the ticket. And I think what you're getting at is the question of would any Democrat have won? I don't know. I haven't been very good at predicting the American people's preferences. I got 2016 wrong. I never thought someone
No,
like
we all
Donald
did. I
Trump
got it wrong. Yeah,
could be
but I'm not a
elected.
White House
And frankly, I
correspondent.
didn't think he could be elected the second time after having gone through court cases and all the revelations about him. But the public made this decision. And I think this self-flagellation that's going on now is if, somebody's to blame in the White House, or somebody's to blame in the Democratic Party, or somebody's to blame in the journalistic press corps is off base. He was an older
So
man, and he ended up giving up power, which is
on
very, very
D-Day,
hard to do.
when he came to Normandy and gave a good speech at Pointe du Hoc. I mean, it was a good speech. We all heard it. It wasn't Reagan, but it was a good speech. Nancy Pelosi, who former Speaker of the House, she told me then, and in conversation, that she felt better about the election. And so this is June of last year. Better about the election chances. She saw the White House has a plan. She asked about, rhetorically, and who can elect that man? She said about Donald Trump. But then a couple of months later, she came on my program and she said, the bottom line was going to be turnout. And she said that she had a lot of friends and Democratic activists and the usual suspects who told her that their kids weren't going to turn out. They were going to sit out the election. Not that they were necessarily going to vote for Trump, but they were going to sit out the election. So that turnout issue ended up being a big, big issue. But as you say, you can't predict, you can't go back and redo the past.
Look, the bottom line, though, Christiane, is that we don't know whether that the country, the direction of the country was such that they wanted to throw the current occupants party out of power, which has been happening all over the world. And in America, these elections are ridiculously close every time. It's 51-49, no matter who wins. Trump didn't win by that much, a few 100,000 votes out of a few
It was
100 million voters.
1.5%.
Yeah, it's not that much. So many factors could come into play, and history only is recorded forward. And I'm not going to spend a lot of my time pointing fingers at this person or that person. What we should be doing is taking the policies of the Trump administration and subjecting them to scrutiny. And that's what I hope we do here.
We are. And in the next, little part of our conversation, I think we're going to ask whether Biden did enough in his time in power, given his, willingness to stand up for, Ukraine and democracy, but whether he did enough to put Ukraine over the line, so to speak, in a way that would bring Putin seriously to the table. Because even now, with Trump in power, Putin is playing silly buggers with the whole idea of negotiations.
And we'll ask the question of whether Trump will be able to get Putin to any different place. And let's take a break, and we can go to that next.
All of you know that this week we had a real chance to take important steps toward ending this war, if only Putin had not been afraid to come to Turkey.
Well, Zelensky's got it right again, because that's exactly what happened. Low-level delegation, obviously sent on purpose by Putin. And the demands were unacceptable. I mean, they're the old demands about how we're not going to go for a ceasefire unless, unless Kyiv pulls out even of territories that Russia hasn't even conquered yet. So these are the same maximalist demands. And now, Jamie, they're talking, Europe certainly is talking about potentially showing Putin which way is up by putting secondary or at least expanding the pain of the sanctions.
Well, look, this is classic Putin. He is trying to avoid being blamed for not stopping the war. And he's worked that very well. Trump has given him every benefit of the doubt, every opportunity to make the right decision. I mean, Zelensky's clearly poking him there by saying he's afraid to come, which he obviously isn't afraid of it. He doesn't want to be put in a position in front of Trump and Zelensky to say, no, he'd prefer to keep the war going. And it's clear to me, I could be proven wrong in the next few days and happy to be proven wrong, that Putin wants to continue this war for some time. His pain threshold has not been reached. He's not ready to make concessions. Our strategy had always been based on the idea that making Putin understand that for the next several years, he's going to face a determined Ukraine military supported by the West with sanctions on Russia. And at some point, the pain threshold and the tolerance threshold. That's what wars are about. When people are just tired and they're ready to give up. Putin is not ready to give up. And the Ukrainian people aren't going to give up if Putin continues. Remember, attacking Ukraine. This war is about military conflict on Ukraine's soil. They're just defending their homes. They'll be happy to stop, but they need the aggressor to stop.
Yeah,
and that's what's becoming clear.
Yeah. Now, the news of this week is that European leaders had a conversation with President Trump ahead of his conversation with President Putin. And we're going to wait to see how that turned out. But there's a little bit of good news for Ukraine. I know it might sound really, small, but it's not. It's big. And that is Romania's election. The president of Romania now is, or is it the prime minister, whatever, the election went for a centrist. Yes, the president. And not the sort of Romanian MAGA who the U.S.
would
was
have been
supporting.
an additional country making it difficult for Ukraine's military and economic assistance. Exactly.
Indeed. And Putin was hoping this guy Simeon would win, and he was like a typical Orban guy. And the interesting thing is, I had the former foreign minister of Ukraine on. I was talking to him this past week, and he was pretty depressed. And he said, what's going to happen to us is strategic encirclement. In other words, he said, we're going to have Hungary's Orban. They don't like us. They don't want to give us, weapons. We're going to have this new, Putin acolyte in Romania. They might cut off, weapons to us. Then we have Poland, who the government likes us, but the president has been very, very right wing. And now there's a runoff.
Still looking close there, but look, all of
close,
this is.
But this is good stuff.
All of this is about what the essential question in the war is. It's about the willingness to confront evil for how long. How much pain will the West tolerate? How much money will they spend to support Ukraine? I believe the invasion of Ukraine is the defining moment of my time in government and in foreign affairs. It's the most important thing that's happened, certainly since 9/11, for an American, to have the large power try to gobble up its neighbor, to violate rule number 1, thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. Commandment
I can repeat
number 1.
that because you say it all the time.
I love it.
Thou shalt not invade thy neighbor.
I think but it tells you how central this issue is. And so now what's happening is Trump is seeing that Zelensky's prepared to have a ceasefire. Zelensky's prepared to go to Istanbul. Zelensky's prepared to be open to all sorts of mineral deals, to a flexible solution that will protect his country. He just wants the invasion of his country to stop. And until Putin makes changes, these negotiations are going to be theater. So let's talk about Istanbul for a second. This is theater.
First, hang on just one second. That was theater. And frankly, I certainly didn't expect, Putin to show up. But what I want to know is, because this is the important next step, Trump says nothing is going to happen until I meet with Putin. So how is that going to go? I was there when he met with Kim Jong-un, and actually nothing happened after that either. So What is going to happen, do you think? What leverage does Trump have right now, and how should he play his cards? And he's talking to the Europeans now. He's not just doing it,
Well,
just
let me
from the
tell you
US
what
perspective.
we would have advised a Biden to do in this situation. Remember, we had 2.5 years, almost 3 years of support for Ukraine. We built up Europeans' NATO support. NATO grew. All the NATO countries together confronting Russia. We wanted Putin to face the prospect of many more years of a grinding war in which he won't get much territory and will have this painful sanctions on him. And remember, 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this war. 1 million. So until Putin
That's according
faces,
to definitely UK intelligence, just so that we're clear.
but think about it. If unless Trump is able to persuade Putin that a failure to make peace will bring more pain to him, he's going to continue the war. And I think we're going to find this summit. My guess, and I hope I'm wrong, but my guess is it's going to be a lot like the Kim Jong Il thing, or Kim Jong Il that you talked about,
Kim
where
Jong
there's
Un,
Kim
Il
Jong
was the
Un. Thank
dad.
you, thank you. I knew I got it slightly wrong. Thank you for that correction, madam.
Yeah, you're
Um,
welcome.
that summit was high in theater. A lot of substance was thrown out, but nothing happened. I don't see any reason to think that Putin is going to fundamentally change his point of view. I think he's hoping to just persuade Trump to keep the pressure on Zelensky. But the direction of this has all been where Trump is slowly realizing that his dream of being able to win a Nobel Prize by ending the war in Ukraine is a lot tougher than he thought. And I don't think we're going to have peace until Trump, realizes that he's got to go all in on Ukraine's side, the victim side, defending Ukraine. And then maybe Putin will make an adjustment in his
And
position.
just to be clear, it's not because he needs to like the victim or bond with Zelensky. It's because it's the right transactional deal to do, right? To put the pressure, to put his cards as leverage. I mean, he's the president of the United States of America, against the invaders.
One of the mysteries of this Trump administration to me is he seems to care about American manufacturing. The one industry he doesn't seem to care about is the defense industry. Right now, if he cared about the defense industry, I think we would find him able to leverage European money to buy American weapons. And that would put pressure on on Russia to compromise on Ukraine and be good for the American defense industry and would help us deal with the fact that Russia and China have these huge militaries. Remember, the biggest military buildup in the world going on right now is in China, with nuclear forces, strategic missiles, ships, all of that. That's beyond the Russian threat. So our defense industry should be getting a lot of attention from Trump. And for some reason, it's the one industry he doesn't seem to care about. He could
Except in a
leverage.
weird way.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of cuts. But Europe to buy American weapons to give to Ukraine, is that what you're saying?
That's what, if I were really transactional, if I were working for Trump right now, that's what I'd tell him. Look, you have the Europeans willing to do things they weren't willing to do before. They're willing to spend money they weren't willing to spend. They're talking about 3%, 4% of GDP. They're talking about spending hundreds of billions of dollars on European arms. Well, why don't you tell them that we're prepared to give Ukraine the continuation of aid from America, not just intelligence, but the right weapons, but leverage the Europeans to buy those weapons from us, and used by Ukraine, be good for our industry, good for the European desire to get America on the side of Ukraine, which is what the Europeans would want. And I bet you could get them to spend half of the money they're planning to spend on European defense on American weapons. And talk about a good deal for the United States. That would be a good deal.
But it's also a bit of a shame that your administration didn't finish the job. I mean, didn't you guys essentially kick the can down the road? You could have done all of this. You could have given more weapons at a better time when they were requested, instead of no, yes, and done a lot more to bring Putin earlier to this state of pain, this threshold of pain, or the balance of pain that you're talking about.
Look,
Yeah, the simple answer is yes.
we could have done more. Sure, we could have done more. I think, Secretary Blinken, who I worked for, was probably the principal advocate of every single one of the weapon systems you're thinking of, which was the tanks or the aircraft, the F-16s or the ATACMS missiles. He was the advocate for them
And the anti-aircraft.
early, and all of that stuff. I would point out, however, madam, that one of the things
Oops, the madam is coming.
and one of the
The
things
deadly madam.
that we could have given earlier were cluster munitions, and you were against that. You and I had a phone call in which you were against cluster munitions.
Yes,
and eventually we
because
gave
it's
it
a
to them.
desperate measure,
Right,
because
but
the
it's
other
to how
stuff
do you-
wasn't sent.
But you
It's a
have
desperate measure.
I think you're wrong. I think defending territory and your home allows you to make a decision what is the right weapon system. The Swedes, the Finns, the Norwegians, they use it. In South Korea, we use it because it's the best way to prevent someone from attacking your territory. The Ukrainians can make a judgment over whether the remaining weapons are a risk to their civilian population, which was what the issue was. They're not illegal. It's just that some countries have decided to ban them. But that would be an example of something we could have done earlier that people, that you have to admit, including yourself, were against. But I would agree with you that I wished we had given more weapons early. But President Biden has calculations that I can't appreciate. We talk about this really easily, but it's truth that Putin was threatening to use nuclear weapons, and that is a very real risk. And eventually we overcame these threats, and maybe we didn't do it quick enough. But I think Biden's theory, and I worked for him in the 80s, and I know him, was that we need to keep NATO together. That as we proceed down the path of giving more and more weaponry, we have to do it as an alliance, all of us together. The weaponry that was subject to debate was basically Polish and Baltic states wanted to do it, but Germans and French didn't want to do it. And so Biden kept the alliance together as we gave more and more aid. Could we have done more? Sure. Cluster munitions, meaning basically mines that attack personnel, and there's a fear that if they don't explode during the conflict, after the war, they're a threat to civilians. So there's been campaigning around the world to prevent landmines with cluster munitions from being used. But if you're at war, sometimes you're prepared to use weapons that even have this risk.
Well, for the record, I was for Patriots and all other anti-missile systems. I was for a no-fly zone. I was for long-range missiles. I was for tanks. I was for all that stuff.
You know what the U.S. military would tell you about a no-fly zone? They would say, in order to put a no-fly zone in place, you have to bomb the Russian anti-aircraft systems that would threaten our planes, or else they won't put the planes up. So we would have to attack the Russian anti-aircraft systems before we put in place a no-fly zone. Biden wasn't prepared to do that. That would put the United States at war with the Russians, and I think that would have been a mistake, and it wasn't necessary to defend Ukraine.
Right. Well, we'll continue.
We'll
And
continue
there
to disagree agreeably
yes,
about
we are
that.
going to be disagreeing. We're going to be disagreeing because there was that window of opportunity, as all the military said, in the fall of 2022, after Putin was on the back foot. Ukraine had the advantage. Anyway, the rest is history, as they say elsewhere. So we're going to take a little break now, and then we're going to come back. We're going to look at how we got here with Putin, and you've got some good stories on that. Welcome back. Christiane Amanpour presents The X-Files, and there is Jamie Rubin also with me. So, we could say, how did Putin become such a monster? But we also have to say that half the world is on his side. The global south believes Putin's whole narrative about, fighting off imperialism and, that whole thing. They don't believe in the Ukrainian victim. So we need to accept that. He's not the global bogeyman. Tell us first, Jamie, because it's so instructive, the character of this KGB official.
Yeah, I was lucky enough. I think it was 2000 or 1999. I can't remember which. Madeleine Albright was sent as Secretary of State to meet this new figure who had replaced Yeltsin, who was in the hospital and was expected to replace Yeltsin as the leader of Russia. I think he was called acting president or something like that. When we went on the trip, she visited Yeltsin in the hospital, and then we go into the Putin meeting. And I have to say, two things about that meeting strike me as really revealing all these years later. The first was his brutality. So when he went through the list of issues, he was talking about Chechnya and the war they were fighting against Chechnya. And I remember he said, we're going to destroy those Chechen rebels down to units as small as a dozen. That means they were going to track down and kill every single rebel, no matter how small the number of people were in their field. I mean, that's a brutal thought to imagine. But the weird part of the meeting was how manipulative he was, how he was trying to sort of manipulate Madeline by sneaking the press in without telling us. And then instead of critiquing our policy, as would be expected, he said, oh, he's very worried that the Mrs. Albright is going to be very tough on him and is going to press him very hard on the Chechnya issue. And he knows she's a really tough lady. And then as soon as the cameras left the room, he had this sort of weird smile on his face. I did that as a favor for you, Mrs. Albright. I know you like to look tough. I went in hundreds of meetings with foreign leaders. I never had that experience where the opposite number was using the press in such a manipulative way to try to get at what they thought was some weakness or unusual quality of the interlocutor, that she liked to look tough. And he was saying, he doesn't care if you look tough. He'll give you that, but I know what you need, and that's why I gave it to you. How weird is that?
It's
Never
weird,
happened.
and it's also him saying that I'm tougher than you are, and I'm gonna, maybe speak nicely and act in a different way. Remember what the famous story with Angela Merkel, when he knew that she hated dogs, she was afraid, she'd been bitten, and he didn't bring some little pooch in. He brings this gigantic, big dog. I don't know.
Weren't there two? I
Rottweiler.
think, if I
I don't
recall
know.
the story,
Anyway,
two
she
dogs.
tells a great story about how she knew what he was doing, and she was damned if she was going to flinch. So she really gathered all the strength that she possibly had, kind of looked straight ahead, didn't look at the dog, didn't look at Putin, and finally the dog was ushered out.
The German government believed for dozens of years that they could bring Russia into the West through economic engagement and through buying their gas, buying their oil, buying their energy. And it was Merkel, who was the leader of that policy, who really believed that somehow everything would be fine if we just integrated our economies. And it took her she still hasn't admitted that her decisions fed into Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. And look, there's a lot of moments we could go back on and try to figure out what we could have done differently. One of them was the famous red line in Syria, where President Obama threatened to use force. Then he didn't use force in Syria. And what happened?
Syria used chemical weapons.
Correct. And what happened is the Russians went in and defended Assad. And that was the beginning of Putin realizing he could roll over the West. And then a few years later, he invaded Ukraine the first time by taking Crimea and starting a war in the East. And then a few years later, he intervened in our election in 2016, and very little pain. Did that documentary?
Yeah, I do. I did a documentary in 2007, 2008 called Zar Putin, and I'd gone to Russia.
Just the name is controversial.
I know. We did it on purpose because that's what we were discovering. Putin, of course, did not give us an interview. He's never given an interview to
a real journalist.
Well, no, I'm not going to say real journalist.
This guy has it. It has it in his DNA. One of the weirdest fun facts that I discovered reading a history book of Stalin was that, ready for this, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of Russia, was the most important Russian was considered a godlike figure during the revolution. He lived by himself, and he had two people who took care of him all day long, a woman and a man. The man was the cook and sort of housekeeper of some kind, or gardening or whatever. That was Vladimir Putin's grandfather. Imagine that. So Vladimir Putin grew up with stories about Vladimir Lenin and the power of the so-called Tsar of Russia, the leader of Russia, even though he wasn't called a Tsar. And so I think that idea of a Russian ruler of total dominance is something that he's understood since he was a little boy. Imagine your grandfather telling you stories about what, he worked for Lenin for, I don't know, a dozen years as the only person who had daily access to Vladimir Lenin. We all collectively failed as a West to realize the danger from Putin a lot earlier.
And just one note, Putin, you remember, famously said the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies or the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. But just this week, he has shown exactly who he is, and it's a cautionary tale to those people who are in occupied territories in Ukraine. in about 2008, in the waning days of the George W. Bush administration, he invaded neighboring Georgia, and he took bits of Ossetia and this and that. And for years, these bits remained the most benighted, the least developed, the most poor parts of Georgia, because you think the Russians were going to do something nice for this occupied territory? No, they didn't. And only now, close to 20 years later, has he offered them the ability to, if they want, apply for Russian citizenship. So that's the tale, for anybody who says that the Ukrainians should accept, Russian occupation, they know they don't want it.
Remember, the collective failure, to me, is demonstrated by this incredible anecdote I remember from the Obama years that someone who was involved told me the story. So President Obama did not want to threaten anything with Russia. He famously said out loud that Russia has escalation dominance, meaning that they can dominate every situation, telling them that he wasn't going to do anything. But not only weren't we going to send arms, as we should have, and as Trump, in fact, did to
arms
Ukraine, to Ukraine after the war in 2014. He was so afraid of the Russians thinking we were involved. Ready for this story? The only thing they were prepared to send was humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So this poor Pentagon official has to figure out how to send meals ready to eat and other, humanitarian goods to Ukraine. At the last minute, the Obama White House calls over in a panic that we're going to use a military transport plane to send these humanitarian goods. And that might give the Russians the wrong impression. And so the plane is canceled. This poor schmo has to hire a German freight company to send American meals ready to eat all the way to Ukraine, because Obama's White House was afraid to send the signal that using a military transport plane would send. And that's how careful that White House was, and Bush, in his own way, made his mistakes. And I think President Biden showed that had he been president back in 2014, he would have done something different. And I believe history will demonstrate that President Biden made the right decision on Ukraine. And I don't think any other Democrat would have done it the same way. I think they would have done it closer to the way Obama dealt with it in 2014. He understood how important Europe was. He understood that NATO will succeed only if we remain together, and that we have to be strong. And yes, he didn't get his second term, and that's history is clear on that. But I'm glad he was president when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, because I'm afraid another Democrat would have not provided the support that we provided all those years. And you asked before about why we didn't give more. Remember, he had a Republican Congress that was opposed to it. The 87 billion or however many billions of dollars of aid was held up for 6 to 9 months by Republicans in Congress, because they somehow believed these weird narratives about the Ukraine war and wanted to focus on immigration.
Because also Trump didn't want it to happen.
That's correct. But that was one of the reasons it was hard to give weaponry to Ukraine under the Biden administration. Look, we'll find out soon, but I think without Putin understanding that he faces a long-term war with the West, supporting Ukraine and increasing sanctions, I don't think he's going to change his position, and the war will continue.
And maybe it's time for secondary sanctions as well. I mean, that's what they're floating, although they won't go straight to that. But that'll, sanctions on those people who buy his oil and stuff like that. On that note, we're out of here. You scored a lot of points with a lot of Democrats. You're going to be very, very unpopular.
Lucidity and truth has to be told.
Okay. James P. Rubin, my ex, goodbye. I think you may have to say something. You can't just wave on a podcast.
Goodbye.